everybody. Let's hope this goes a little quicker than the last meeting and we can get back on schedule a little bit. You all have an agenda in front of you. Any changes to that agenda, additions, or anything of that nature? Seeing none, we'll consider that approved. The last meeting was in October 2012 of this board, and the proceedings were sent to you. Any changes or comments to those? Seeing none, we'll consider the minutes approved. This is where we open it up to public comment for anything that's not on the agenda. If there's anyone, we'd have no one signed up, but if there's anyone in the audience that would wish to speak, seeing none, we will move on. I will now turn it over to the Technical Committee Chair, Joe Cimino, and we'll talk about stock status indicators for 2013. Joe, all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The TC has been tasked with providing these updates on an annual basis, and I believe the last time I was before you, we were considering these potential stock indicators, and now we've moved on to these are ones that we feel that are both hopefully tracking the abundance of the fishery, but also ones that are easy enough to update on an annual basis. We have 3 adult indices that have been around and been through peer review now. These were included in the last peer-reviewed assessment. The recreational catch per unit effort from the private rental mode, Delaware trawl survey, and the New Jersey trawl survey. Wish I had some good news for you guys, but this is a standardized index based on these 3 the 2 fisheries independent surveys and the rec catch per unit effort. You can see in recent years that both the Delaware trawl survey and the rec catch per unit effort have kind of flatlined. Although it does seem that the New Jersey trawl survey has been tracking some small increase in abundance in biomass. One other thing that we have been updating annually and that has also been around since the last peer-reviewed assessment is a proportional stock density. And this is something that is fairly easy to calculate. It's based on our 2 fisheries independent indices that we use. And it quantifies the length frequency, meaning it's using actual sampled fish and giving a proportion of those fish that are 8 inches and above to those fish that are a little over 13 inches and above. And I think the real take-home message from the PSD isn't necessarily a good one. It's that even though we still have a biomass out there, albeit low, for the past few years, it's been stable at about 3 to 4% of an unfished biomass. You see since about 2006, 2007, that the proportion of those fish that are seen in the trawl surveys is very small. So that there's almost none of the fish being sampled are over that 13-inch size limit or recruiting into the fishery. Relative F was the primary determinant that was accepted by the peer review committee to give at least some trends in this non-equilibrium fishery. Relative F is calculated based on our total removals and the rec CPUE. As far as the total removals are concerned, you can see that they've also tanked even prior to Addendum 4 to Amendment 4, when the 100-pound commercial trip limit and 1 fish recreational bag limit was put in place. You could see that even in the years prior to that, that landings were extremely low. have that as a breakdown of commercial and recreational fisheries going through the time series where recreational estimates are available. These landings are in pounds and in millions of pounds. And you can see that in more recent years, well, the scale is very low, but also that the magnitude of the commercial and recreational fisheries have sort of come in line. And just shortening that time series to when MRIP estimates existed, it allows us to look at a finer scale, and these landings are in thousands of pounds, and you can see that over a few years, the commercial and recreational fisheries have actually flip-flopped. But overall, very low. We really started coming down right after 2002, where coast-wide we were coming in under 5 million pounds for the first time, and now we're around 500,000 pounds contributing between the two. There should be a big asterisk next to 2013 here. There's just a big weakfish there, but these data, of course, are preliminary, but in all honesty, I kind of cobbled this together at the last minute, calling states to get commercial landings, and as you know, MRIP estimates are preliminary, but the reason I did it was because there was a uptick in 2012, and this was a 2012 summary for you. However, I was very curious whether to see if that was just a blip on the radar or maybe we were going somewhere with this. And it looks like the MRIP estimates have come back down some in 2013, but overall coast-wide commercial landings are up again. We're back around where we were in 2009, and again that's prior to the 100-pound trip limit. In that same MRIP time period, I just included releases as well as harvest, and you can see that releases have bounced around a little bit. I'm not sure what the one fish bag limit has meant to the harvest to release ratio, and you can see that it's even bounced around some there. And so with that presentation on removals and on the biomass, we can look at relative F, which what we've been doing is using a 2-year mean of the recreational CPUE. So our relative F estimate only goes back as far as 2011. However, just using the straight mean, relative exploitation was calculated, and as you can see, and as you would expect, with that uptick in harvest in 2012, relative exploitation is also increasing somewhat, but still well below time series average. Most of you have seen this plot before. This is just an attempt to look at the response of the stock, both, I guess, to fishing pressure and possibly to the regulations. He's starting off in 81 with the time series. You can see relative fishing mortality, relative F was an extreme increase through the late 80s. And the stock's response was a massive decline, and at that low abundance, however, as fishing mortality decreased, the biomass did not have much of a response. At that time, Amendments 2 and 3 were put in place, and in that period prior to 2002, we did see some rebuilding of the stock. That's the green triangles there. However, since that time and since Amendment 4, despite ever decreasing fishing mortality, we really haven't seen any response from the stock. At the time of the last peer review assessment, the juvenile indices still looked pretty good. There was a lot of interannual variability. We're fortunate to have quite a few states that have are able to generate indices through sampling. They don't necessarily all tell the same story, but you can see there that on a standard format that the grand mean did show some nice consistent pattern. However, as we were moving into the stock assessment, we noted concern at that time that since 2006 through, I believe, data through 08 or 09, things looked a little more troubling, and that trend continues. We don't see those, as you can see there, that grand mean has not moved much, and it is below, time. It is a low point in the series. In summary, like I said, since Addendum 4, the estimated biomass has not moved much. It was at 3% of an unfished biomass at that time, well below the 20% threshold that was set. We're looking at the latest 2012 estimate at about 4% of an unfished biomass. And I think, that chart with the proportional stock density shows a real concern that what biomass is there is all one-year-old fish, and there really is a concern over what the productivity is for the stock that exists. One target that has been discussed is attaining levels that back in the mid-90s. One other thing that I did want to report on was compliance with the 100-pound commercial trip limit. And I believe at the time that the addendum was put in place, this was also looked at as a possible indicator of where the stock was. And it was mentioned several times that if there were a lot of trips that were able to max out this 100-pound trip limit, then in a way that would be a good thing as far as the stock response. And at that time, with no baseline on what this would mean, we really didn't know where to go with it. We have a few years under our belt now. This was put in, states were required to have this put in place by May 2010. And you can see here that on the 2012 harvest, we do have some states combining either over 100 pounds or right at the 100-pound trip limit, that are around 10% of their overall harvest is at or above the 100-pound trip limit. But like I said, we've never really set any sort of high mark for this on what would be a consideration to move forward with this. One note here is that North Carolina put in place the 100-pound trip limit for November, so this is November and December only for North Carolina. I think that's it.
Thank you very much for that uplifting report, Joe. Questions for Joe? John?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Joe. I was just curious whether the TC, if there's been any progress made in the last assessment, found that it was an increase in natural mortality that was preventing weak fish from recovering. I haven't heard of anything coming out that would indicate what the cause of that is. Any clues?
No, John, there really hasn't been much exploration into that. We have continued to update some of the predator-prey models that we have, and there is an element of best fit in one of the models that has a striped bass to menhaden ratio in it, but that going forward, that's as far as we've gone with it.
Rob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Joe. And I've got two questions. One is, with relative F, it used to be just the Mid-Atlantic component of MERS, and your slides suggested that probably at some point that changed to the full geographical range. I'm not sure.
Actually, you're right in that the slide did suggest that, but it is still the Mid-Atlantic component, I believe. Yeah. And so that does bring up an interesting question, I suppose, because some of the southern states have had a higher catch.
May I follow up, Mr. Chairman? And yes, I was going to say that a few years ago it was the more southerly states which were showing a sort of different pattern with the CPUE. I also noticed it looked like from here, anyway, that it was 1981 forward on one of the relative F slides. And I'm wondering, not so much whether that's correct, but I'm wondering with the MRF switch to MRIP, what are we really looking at there?
Yeah, it was 81, and that was on the stock response slide. Looking at Weakfish's MRFs to MRIP estimates, I don't think we saw any strong biases at the state level or coast-wide. So.
Go ahead, Rob.
One more and I'm out, Mr. Chairman. I always protest, so I'm going to continue to protest about this juvenile abundance indices graph that you showed us. And my concern is we have a weighted or an unweighted mean, and all the state-specific indices are standardized. But many years ago, with one of the assessments, I don't remember the exact number of the assessment, it was pointed out that it'd be better to look during the period where there was a truncated stock, which there definitely is now, to look at the core area. This is something that Jack Music brought forward in one of the previous assessments. So when I see this slide, I mean, I don't really know what's going on as far as the trend, because if it's unweighted, does that mean every state from Georgia to Rhode Island is just unweighted and lumped together? And is that informative as much as the typical producer areas being shown? And so what I would suggest in the future is at least let's have a table or a graph for the states to see how things are going, so we can discern maybe some importance here. And the reason is that John Clark just mentioned the natural mortality, and if it's a situation where there's this proverbial bottleneck where recruitment has been fairly stable, although it shows a little bit of a downturn recently, then we need to know exactly how recruitment is doing, since we're not going to be able to find out apparently about the bottleneck, which we assume is predation, but we really haven't had anything more definitive. So again, I would make a suggestion that this be developed a little bit more. Anyone who sees this figure now, this figure 5, just is left with not really being informed about the stock and about the past distribution and everything else. Thank you.
I fully agree, yes, and it is something that the TC is going to look at, and I agree that I wouldn't know. I certainly have concerns on how to interpret that as well, and so looking at that as weighted would certainly help.
Roy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Joe. Just to explore those ideas that Rob mentioned just a little more, and looking at Figure 5, I don't want to put too much faith in it, I guess, but our dealings with utilities over the years, which are sources of potentially large entrainment and impingement mortality that can affect weak fish stocks, they always pointed to, yes, entrainment and impingement is going on, but look at your juvenile indices for weak fish. They bounce up and down a little bit, but there's no long-term discernible trend. And when you look at Figure 5, if you go back to the 1980s, there doesn't appear to be a discernible trend, other than, as Joe pointed out, maybe in the most recent years. And yet, when you look at the natural mortality from Figure 7, there's a great elevation of M in the most recent years. And under the assumption that the juveniles are being produced at a fairly steady rate each year, it begs the obvious question of what's happening to them. You know, what's preying on them? What's the source of that mortality, that high natural mortality? I just wish we had, maybe Joe can help. Do you have any additional insights on that? Thanks.
I would have had a better slide for you if I did. No, and I think that's a challenge that TC and Stock Assessment Subcommittee do need to look at. But it, for better or worse, I mentioned that we were fortunate to have this much information on juvenile indices. You know, and even though this is a coast-wide stock, you know, you get very different answers from each of these individual surveys, and even within the Chesapeake Bay, you know, I've had that discussion with Jim Uphoff, who updates this every year on how different Maryland and Virginia could be. So, what the variability coast-wide means has been difficult, and what we're coming down to now is also, I think it's hard to say, but going back to what I said earlier, you know, at least addressing this current trend, if all we're looking at is spawning 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds, I mean, this stock is somewhat unique to others that you deal with, in that, you know, we're considering age 1 plus to be part of the spawning stock biomass. But if they're the only part of the spawning stock biomass, then I think that suggests we're in trouble.
Lewis?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Joe. Just a couple of comments, observations, and then a question. This year, or last year, I received tremendous numbers of phone calls on the discards that were occurring in the commercial fishery in North Carolina. Some folks saying as high as 1,000 to 2,000 pounds a trip with the numbers of fish that we're seeing at home, and legal fish, so nice sized fish. We had a pretty epic recreational fishery this year, with tremendous numbers of discards and releases in that fishery. Not sure that we're picking all that up, but we do have I think we're having an extraordinary amount of unquantified discard mortality in our fishery, and it seems to be right at that Cape Hatteras line, which continues to suggest that there's something going on different north and south of Hatteras. We don't have the genetic integrity to prove they're separate stocks, but from what we're seeing from the recruitment event that occurred this year, the 6 to 8 month old weakfish that we were seeing were off the charts in terms of the numbers. So with that said, I'm just curious, because what doesn't make sense to me about the relative F graph is with the catches being constrained at 100 pounds, how do removals really mean anything in terms of trying to track the status of the stock?
I agree again. I personally, and I not to be unfair to the TC or the report, but discards have been somewhat glossed over. And going to the 1 fish and 100 pound trip limit, you know, we've completely changed the nature of this fishery, and you know, I don't know what has happened with discards. It's always been difficult to estimate discards, and Jeff Bruss spent a lot of time doing that for the last assessment, and since then we had started with just a stepwise approach, and then once we got to the most recent restrictions, we've just kind of been in a holding pattern and leaving discards at one flat level estimate. Not the best way to do things, but you know, it's something we need to explore.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a real quick follow-up, because after many calls from the Outer Banks predominantly, I asked my technical committee member to talk to the other technical committee members, and it doesn't sound like anybody north of us is seeing the numbers of fish and the amount of discards and bycatch that we're seeing in North Carolina. So it just makes it even more difficult, because I thought, well, if everybody else is seeing this, maybe we can start looking at allowing a little more harvest to at least account for these discards, but it sounds like it's pretty unique to us.
Yeah, well, we are in the process of initiating the next stock assessment, so maybe we can get to the bottom of some of that stuff. Pat?
Yes, thank you. Good report, Joe, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned predator-prey, and is that an ongoing study, or is that just something that has been looked at in the past? Because I really need to address that one. It sounds like, if talking to John Clark and the folks over there, it looks like Delaware is having a great increase in, I guess, black drum, and the Chesapeake's having a great increase in black drum also. And if they're moving up along the coast, we're back to predator-prey. It used to be striped bass, now it's something else. And I'm not sure how you can address that, or can you help me with that to give us some clarification as to what you think we should do with predator-prey, and should we ask you folks to start looking at that a little more closer? Use your opinion, Joe. Forget the technical committee.
That's just in part, and if it's something that we could get through a peer review, which I think the predator-prey modeling that was done really as early as the 2004 assessment, and then presented in the 2009 peer review assessment. The peer review didn't feel that comfortable with drawing the connections made from something as simple as having another species there as a function of the decline of weakfish, and that's how we ended up with relative F being the one truly endorsed situation. So I don't know that any information exists for us to move forward with making that attempt again on a strong enough connection as far as the stock decline. So,
well, thank you for that. Well, it's just like when we started talking about winter flounder, and it ends up at natural mortality. No matter what we've done, stock doesn't seem to be coming back, and that's forgetting what's happening up in Gulf of Maine. But the rest of it seems to be consistent. It's there for a month or two. They spawn out, and the bottom is covered. The bays are covered with little winter flounder, and then within a month to 6 weeks, they're gone. And yet you look at the predator-prey relationship, and you say to yourself, something's eating them, or they're just dying. But if we keep kicking the can down the road on this one, I think we're going to have another one of those species that's going to be, we don't know. And I'm not sure how we can make management decisions based on not knowing. So, Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you want to put some pressure on or suggest that we start looking at a predator-prey situation or not. And I'll leave it up to you and the technical committee to come up with a recommendation.
Well, since I was part of that last stock assessment for Weakfish of the technical committee, and I know what they've gone through trying to come up with something for that, and that's about as good as it's going to get. And maybe they can do some more on this one. I'll put some pressure on Joe. We'll take him in the back room, take care of that.
Whip him up pretty good.
See what we can do. Tom, did you have a comment?
Yeah, if I remember right, black drum eat mollusk and clams. That's why they used to blow them up in 1900s in Barnegat Bay, because they were eating all the clams in the clam beds. But I never heard them eating weakfish. So, yeah, I mean, it's always been disappointing to me that we did everything right when weakfish should be a lot different than it is right now. It should be a success story because we did all the right things, and it's not. But I think the more you look at it, the more you're going to have to look at what's going on in the bays and estuaries where they spawn. What is, when some of the studies they did in New York on winter flounder, when it was 17-1, 16-1, 15-1, female to male relationship, because of all the, as we say, the estrogen endocrine disruptors that are in the bays coming out of the sewers, I think that could be a problem. I'm not sure where to place the blame, but it is someplace, and I think we just spin our heads. We've been spinning our heads on it for the last 10 years, and we still haven't come up with an answer. I don't think we're going to do. We just got to stay the path and see what happens. I mean, because there's only, unless we're going to do like stop the power plant and Salem nuclear power plant in Delaware Bay from killing 50% of the bay anchovies. Maybe that's a problem. Or they were sucking them in. They used to suck the weakfish in for their intake valve. That's a problem. Or we change the ecology of the bays in Barnegat Bay. We do the hot water from Oyster Creek, and they still have impingement and water being sucked in at an unusual rate. And that's not just nuclear power plants, it's all the other ones, and coal-fired plants and everything else. So we started changing the system we put in the 70s and the 80s and started using the best bays and estuaries as our sewers and our hot water intake or cold water cool-down systems. There's going to be a lot of problems with the resource.
Okay, if there's no other questions for Joe, we're going to move on to the next agenda item, considering Delaware's conservation equivalency proposal, and I'll turn that over to John, and then we'll have the technical committee report on that also. So, John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try to make this fast because I know we've been doing a lot of sitting around here. Thank you to the board. I'd just like to briefly go over our proposal again that I think you've all seen already. And just looking at our logo there reminds me that we were talking yesterday during the summer flounder deliberations about each state having a signature fish, and for us in Delaware it is Weakfish. And next. And that's one of the reasons that we chose net closure days I'll go into here next. We had huge recreational and commercial weakfish fisheries in Delaware Bay in the 70s and 80s. Delaware Bay was probably the epicenter of weakfish abundance at that time, and when the weakfish population declined in the late 80s and into the 90s and management actions were taken, next, we went to net closure days as the way to meet our reduction in fishing mortality for weakfish, because this way we keep nets out of the water on the weekends during the peak recreational weakfish fishing period and still allow netters to catch a lot of weakfish, thereby preventing gear interactions between gill netters and recreational fishermen. Next. And in addition, Delaware already had a law on the books banning gill netting on weekends during the peak weakfish season, which I'll get to. Next. So our Fmp Compliance that we used, next. Since '97, we've required nets to be out of the water for a week in May, a week in June, and all weekends in May and June to meet the Amendment 3 compliance requirements. Next. And in our regulations, we've defined weekend as Friday through Sunday. We've done this once again at the time to reduce those interactions, as Friday through Sunday were our biggest days for recreational fishing for weakfish, and those are the 34 closure days we had in 2013. Next. There's our code that requires us to have all nets out of the water from Saturday through Sunday, starting on May 10th and going through September 30th. So, as I said, we already had that in the code. Next. And so the Weakfish Plan added 17 closure days in 2013 to the state-mandated closure days that we already had due to this law. Next. As the weakfish catches, as Joe has just pointed out, have declined precipitously, our commercial landings between 98 and 2008 declined by 99%. Our netters have started looking to other species that they can try to make a living off of. Black drum are in Delaware Bay in May and June, and the closure days limit the ability of netters to pursue black drum because our closure days have netting closed for 34 days. Atlantic menhaden is in high demand in May in Delaware as bait for striped bass, particularly on weekends. But with our weekend being defined as Friday through Sunday that netters can't net, menhaden caught on Thursday can't be sold as fresh bait on Sunday. So our netters are missing out on that lucrative market of selling fresh bait. Next. The netters have come to us and to the Tidal Finfish Council and asked us to see if we could modify our closure day system. And they asked us to look into asking ASMFC to allow us to use the alternative state management regime as per Amendment 3 and switch from closure days to a closed season. Next. We would estimate the length of a closed weakfish season that would give us the equivalent of the current closure days in terms of reduction in fishing mortality. And so, next. Okay, so to follow the ASMFC guidelines in estimating the necessary closed season, next, the closed season must occur during the months of maximum weakfish landings during 1989 to 1991. I know we've been talking about ancient data, but that's what the amendment says we have to do. Most weakfish were landed during April through June in Delaware. Our peak landings month was May. We've estimated that a closed season from May 1st to June 2nd would give us the required 32% reduction in fishing mortality. And I just would also like to point out that we will still have 17 net closure days as mandated by the state law during that time that was not factored into the closed season that we're asking for. So I would be glad to take any questions, and we hope the board can endorse Delaware changing to a closed season from closure days. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Before I take any questions, I'd really like to get to the technical committee's report also and take care of that, and that way we can handle it all in one shot, I hope. So, Joe, if you're ready, we'll move to the technical committee.
This was actually a joint conference call between the technical committee and the stock assessment subcommittee, and I started off. I started off that call kind of reiterating what John said, that we're looking at ancient data, and this isn't the stock that we were dealing with in the late 80s, and if Delaware had a whole bunch of nets in the water, I'd still be very surprised if they didn't meet their % reduction in harvest, just because the fish aren't there. But we're dealing with two different amendments that are still holding us to this review, I think, and that is the original requirements of Amendment 3, but also importantly in Addendum 4 to Amendment 3. I think we all recognize that a lot of stuff had been done to protect this stock, and states had very creative ways of doing that, and instead of trying to go back and remove some of those other restrictions that have been put in place, the 100-pound trip limit and the one fish recreational bag limit were put in place on top of all remaining requirements. So with that, the TC and Stock Assessment Subcommittee simply reviewed this as kind of an alternate management scheme to that original addendum, Amendment 3 requirement. And maybe if you have the last slide that they have. Yeah. And just what they presented there is, on paper, this certainly does meet that reduction in that requirement. So aside from that, there was some concern that you're going from nets out of the water to nets in the water. In the case of black drum, we didn't have a great deal of concern that black drum nets were going to be taking a lot of weak fish, but there would certainly be a potential for interactions between gill nets fished for menhaden and weak fish. But I think what's still in place for Delaware, especially regarding the fact that this is mostly a drift gill net fishery, that alleviated a lot of our concerns. And looking at this in comparison to what every other state has been held to, we certainly didn't see anything out of the ordinary.
Thank you, Joe. I'll open it up to the board now. If they have any questions of John or Joe, please raise your hand. David Pierce.
Yeah, John, a question about your drift gill net fishery. How does that operate? The gill nets are set for some short period of time, left to drift. How would you describe that fishery, just in the context of potential for bycatch of weakfish?
Right. Well, this is, we have anchor netting is ended as of May 1st, so we only allow drift netting at that time. And typically, the guys go out and set the nets for maybe an hour or so, maybe longer. But there is clearly the potential for weakfish bycatch. I mean, a lot of times they're using a mesh that's small enough to catch weakfish as they're targeting menhaden or bluefish, croaker, spot, those type of things and anything pretty much they can catch in Delaware Bay at that time.
Lewis?
You ready for a motion?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to move we approve Delaware's request for conservation equivalency.
Second by Pat Augustine. Is there any discussion on the motion? If not, I'll read it when it's ready. We will be doing a roll call vote on this, so when we're ready, I will hand it over to Marin. You ready, Joe? Move to approve Delaware's request for conservation equivalence. Motion by Mr. Daniel, seconded by Mr. Augustine. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll hand it over to Marin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Massachusetts?
Yes.
Rhode Island?
Yes.
Connecticut?
Yes.
New York?
Yes.
New Jersey?
Yes.
Delaware?
Yes.
Maryland?
Yes.
Potomac River Fisheries Commission?
Yes.
Virginia?
Yes.
North Carolina?
Yes.
South Carolina?
Yes.
Georgia?
Yes.
Florida?
Yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife?
Yes.
And National Marine Fisheries Service?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sounded unanimous there. Very good. Okay, we're just about done. What do you have to... Okay. I'm going to have someone make a recommendation for Vice Chair. Mr. Miller?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my honor to nominate Rob O'Reilly as Vice Chair for the Weakfish Board. Thank you.
Seconded by Pat.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I move to accept that nomination on his behalf. Cast one vote. Close nomination and cast one vote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So done. Rob?
Since I won't have anything to say for a little while, I do want to say that since we spend a lot of time looking back at what has been done and whether it's relevant, and I saw a comment in the report, the technical committee wondering on the relevance of the time frame when these measures were done back in the late 80s and early 90s, but I would suggest that we should pay attention to that particular time period because it was meant to have a 32% reduction so that it would signal the start of rebuilding. And so if we get to those level of abundances that we were hoping for then at least we have something to start from. So I think it should be relevant.
Let's hope that's under your watch, Rob. If there's nothing else to come before this board, motion to adjourn is accepted. Let's move it.
We'll get business session going in about 10 minutes.